Come on back, peaceful.
Whoa, easy now.
I'm gonna be free or die. I've been walking with my face turned to the sun. Weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Oh, I got eyes in the back of my head.
Harriet Tubman, savior of the enslaved. But what else?
Hello, listeners. This is Kaitlyn.
And this is Julianna. Welcome to our safe place where all are welcomed. A place to counteract some of the American exceptionalist misinformation that is pumped into the public minds by giving you authenticity. But first, I implore you all to get into a headspace where you can absorb any amount of inspiration. Inspiration to be courageous, inspiration to be resourceful, inspiration to not be confined to the limitations that restrict us, and inspiration to reject social norms. Now, please keep that inspiration in mind as we discuss today's topic, as we discuss someone who lived and breathed for equality of all in the name of liberation and justice.
And today we are here to teach you about a woman solely known for the liberation of the enslaved, resistor of the inhumane treatment of Africans during a dark period of American history.
To most people, she is almost a mythological figure, one who freed hundreds upon thousands of lives. Yet the truth of her accomplishments is often shrouded in misconceptions and over-exaggerations throughout the course of history.
Here to clear up said misconceptions and turn Harriet from an almost unimaginable pillar of heroism to a figure which demonstrates the potential anyone can have in the pursuit of justice and equality. We will discuss how exactly Harriet is mythologized, what exactly happened to Harriet in reality, and discuss some of the less talked about aspects of her life outside the Underground Railroad.
Before delving into Harriet herself, how exactly these myths and misconceptions even started needs to be discussed to better understand how and why Harriet was mythologized. See, one of the main sources of misinformation surrounding Harriet actually come from pro-abolitionist allies during the 1860s. A biography about her life, Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, written by Sarah Bradford, is full of errors that would evolve into a few popular myths that are perpetuated to this day. As mentioned in Dr. Kate Clifford's Larson's article, Harriet Tubman, A Life Beyond Myth, which discusses these popular myths, Bradford had only 3 or 4 months to complete the project, due to a trip in Europe she would go on. In such a short period of time, Dr. Larson describes how Bradford rushed to complete the biography, which many of her friends complained that the book had many errors, which included misinformation like Harriet Tubman rescued 300 people in 19 trips to the Deep South, when in actuality, she brought about 70 people, family and friends, to freedom during approximately 13 trips to Maryland.
Even her original escape from her enslavement is surrounded by misinformation. As pointed out by Dr. Larson, an anti-slavery advocate named Sally Hawley, quote, made up the still popular 40,000 bounty figure in 1867 while trying to publicize Tubman's petition for a military pension, unquote. On October 3rd, 1849, there was a bounty of $100 placed upon Harriet's head in an advert for returning her and her 2 brothers for a grand total of $300 to their enslavers. As Dr. Larson points out, a bounty as huge as $40,000, which, quote, is equivalent to several million US dollars, unquote, would be reserved for those which the United States viewed as a national threat or commit a serious crime, which in comparison Dr. Larson mentions the $50,000 bounty for John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln. Harriet Tubman's initial escape was an almost common occurrence in comparison to the assassination of President Lincoln, which, while getting her back was likely important to her enslavers, would not gain the same national attention nor warrant a humongous bounty that would be $40,000. This is not to say that what she did not have a national impact due to a small bounty. Far from it. But it is important to have an accurate understanding of what Harriet experienced during her life in order to not only comprehend her own triumphs and hardships, but also have a better understanding of history and the impact which these historical events have on the present.
With all this said about myths and misinformation surrounding her, it leaves one question. Who really was Harriet Tubman?
Segment 1. Who was Harriet Tubman?
Based on Judith Nie's 9 Women, Harriet Tubman was one of 10 or 11 children who would be forced to work on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland at the age of 6 years old. At a young age, Harriet endured and was exposed to the cruelty of enslavement, as Nies puts it. Harriet's first lesson was not reading or writing, but preparing herself for the system of punishments by purposefully wearing thicker clothing to protect her skin from whippings and learn to shriek loud enough to end her mistress's whippings sooner. These horrific whippings, constant labor, and lack of sleep and food would contribute to Harriet also falling ill at a young age, where she would be nursed back to the health by her mother. Harriet also experienced 2 of her sisters being sold, which instilled a fear of being sold south, which remained with her all her life.
Harriet Tubman became deeply aware of the dehumanization of enslaved Africans during the 1800s through her childhood experiences alone. She quickly understood that she, her friends, and family were not seen as human beings by their white enslavers, but rather livestock to control, beat, breed, and sell off in the name of profit. Harriet herself would come to this realization when she was around 13 years old. See, when Harriet was 13 during one fall day, she would be an unintended victim of an overseer's wrath towards an enslaved man at a supply store. The enslaved man apparently, quote, left his work without permission, unquote, which enraged the overseer at the store. The furious overseer demanded that those around him restrain the enslaved man, including Harriet, who refused to do so. In the chaos, the enslaved man flees the store, prompting the overseer to hurl, quote, a 2-pound lead weight, unquote, at the man, but unfortunately the weight would collide into Harriet's skull. Harriet would suffer massive head and brain injuries, which would lead her to be in a state between life and death for months. No one but her family would provide medical aid to her injuries, while her enslaver decided it was best to try to sell Harriet off, as she desperately clung to whatever life she had in her. As described by those around her when she finally awakened that Christmas, quote, she talked to herself, babbled in delirium, and had strange fits of silence, falling asleep for 15 or 20 minutes, unquote. She had developed sleeping seizures as a result of her head injuries.
Because of the lack of medical treatment that could treat how severe her injuries were, her sleeping seizures would plague her for the rest of her life. Instead of remaining helpless, however, Harriet would use her sleeping seizures to her advantage, as she should. Nies mentions how Harriet would utilize her condition by faking one of her seizures when someone came around with an unpleasant job, finding ways to avoid being further exploited with her condition. Despite all of the abuse her mind, body, and soul went through during her youth, she survived it all. Rather than simply accepting her suffering at the hands of her mistress, Harriet found ways to at least minimize that harm done to her body. Harriet managed to persevere through her harrowing recovery of her head injuries and would cleverly use the resulting side effects to her benefit as a child to avoid exploitative labor. Her childhood experiences as an enslaved child, while being hardships no human should ever face, would build the foundation of Harriet becoming a profound and skillful liberator, starting with herself and her two brothers.
What prompted Harriet to escape her plantation initially with her two brothers were rumors that she and her brothers were planned to be sold, along with other enslaved people after the death of their enslaver. Even though she was difficult to sell during her youth, mostly due to her sleeping seizures, and would be married to a freedman named John Tubman, Harriet was still vulnerable to being sold off without a second thought as a young woman. Her fear of being sold, a fear she had ever since she was a little girl. It was about to become a reality, but instead of succumbing to fear and despair, Harriet decided to make a harrowing escape to take control of her life. As Nice describes, this escape would entail, quote, setting out by foot to travel at night to a land they had never seen before, in order to attain a liberty they had never known, unquote. For Harriet, quote, she had no idea how many miles it was to Pennsylvania, nor could she have read a map if she had one, unquote. But she pursued freedom night and day, quote, following the North Star when the weather was clear, feeling the moss which grew on the north side of tree trunks when it was cloudy, unquote. In order to avoid those who would hunt them down and return them to enslavement, where a horrific punishment for the escape likely awaited them, quote, traveling only at night, sleeping in the woods by day, fearing even the white strangers who helped the Underground Railroad, unquote, due to the, quote, terrible stories of slaves caught by bloodhounds, unquote, by white enslavers, made each second of the journey tense and dangerous, where one mistake could be deadly. Not everyone would be able to make this journey. Harriet's own two brothers decided to turn around and return to their plantation, the uncertainty of their survival to achieve freedom being too much to bear. Harriet, however, viewed being enslaved once again as a fate worse than death, or even dying in the pursuit of freedom would be preferable. And so, her brothers left her to pursue freedom on her own. Imagine what that must have been like, where only after the first day of your escape you were left alone by your own siblings to survive on your own. To constantly fret that every snapped branch or rustle of the leaves could be a person who was akin to a predator, tracking and hunting you down to strip you away of your humanity once more. To be at the mercy of your own body as it randomly forces you to shut down. To pass out as precious minutes vanish from your consciousness. To feel that gnawing hunger in your stomach as your mouth is desperately in need of water. To constantly be on edge that the friendly face you thought you could trust was only a wolf in sheep's clothing, who sees you only as an easy target to exploit. This is likely what Harriet had to deal with during those long, long miles to freedom.
Even as she managed to get to Philadelphia on her own, Harriet now had to figure out what she could do to survive as a freed woman. As Nias mentioned, she felt like a prisoner who had been released from 25 years in prison only to come home to an empty place. She knew no one in Philadelphia, no family, no friends, not a friendly face that she could turn to from her old life. While she did find work and was starting to make a life for herself, knowing that her family and friends were still suffering under those cruel eyes of their enslavers lingered in the back of her mind. It got to the point where Harriet decided that she had to do something, that her own freedom depended on the freedom of others. It was in that moment which Harriet decided to join the Underground Railroad.
Segment 2. The Underground Legend. Fact versus fiction. When most people hear the Underground Railroad, most people think of things like the quilt code, where different colored fabrics were visible signals as to what potential allies had to offer to conductors liberating the enslaved. And maybe even imagining a literal underground train which took the enslaved from the south to the north in Canada. This portrayal of the Underground Railroad, like Harriet's bounty and how many people she actually liberated through the railroad, are also myths and misconceptions. There was never a quilt code, which conductors like Harriet followed, nor were there any convenient trains passing through the country that connected the oppressive South to the liberating North. So what would someone like Harriet do during her 13 trips into Maryland to save 70 of her friends and family members?
Harriet was a brilliant, brave, and clever woman who would rely on the skills she developed during her youth and her own escape from enslavement to help others. She used the stars to guide her path as she became more and more familiar with the path to Maryland from abolitionist areas like Philadelphia. Because of the risks involved with strangers, she would only take those she knew and would only receive aid from those she trusted from previous trips. Harriet never had a quilt code to give her hints as to where to go or who wanted to help her in her group. She could not read maps to navigate new routes. She had to trust the ones she knew and the North Star which shined above during the night. Depending upon who she was able to rescue from a plantation, she would utilize their characteristics to the best of her ability to fool those who would punish them all for escaping. As Nias describes it, if Tubman's party included 3 females and 2 men, she might have one of them dressed as a woman, so they did not match the description of wanted notices about the group. If one of the people she freed passed as a white master, she would have them pretend to be a master transporting slaves to another town. As clarified by Dr. Larson in her article, she carried a pistol, more for protection than to threaten freedom seekers to continue on the journey.
It was through these clever and strategic methods which allowed Harriet Tubman to be one of the most successful conductors of the railroad. Even as laws were passed to make aiding those escaping their enslavement harder and so lengthening Harriet's journey, Harriet still never lost a single person out of the 70 people she freed. As detailed by Dr. Larson, Harriet, quote, followed rivers that snaked northward. She used the stars and other natural phenomena to inform and guide her, unquote, as she, quote, felt fortified by her deep faith, unquote, to take on the challenges she faced. Focusing on Harriet's faith for a moment, it was truly unique to her and her alone. Her beliefs, quote, had nothing to do with organized churches, unquote. Yet, as quoted by Nice from Thomas Garrett, quote, had more confidence in the voice of God as spoken direct to her soul, unquote. Harriet firmly believed that God was on her side during her trips in the Underground Railroad and would continue to believe in God for the rest of her days. This faith would extend into her other roles she played in her life. The roles she would take on during the Civil War as tensions reached a breaking point in the abolition of slavery. Segment 3. Civil War, Spy of the Union, and General Tubman. As Harriet began to gain notoriety from her work in the Underground Railroad, she would join forces with abolitionists such as John Brown in order to disrupt the slave economy in the United States through inciting rebellions across different plantations. While the efforts of the Underground Railroad did start affecting wealthy white enslavers and making the general white population in the United States aware of the treatment of enslaved African and African Americans, many abolitionists viewed that more action needed to be taken. As Nice mentions, even Harriet viewed that slavery, quote, would be outlawed only when the costs of maintaining it were greater than those of abolishing it, unquote. Because of this belief, Harriet would support John Brown's efforts to incite rebellions across the United States by being, quote, an active recruiter for John Brown, even while continuing to act as a conductor, unquote. It was actually John Brown himself who started referring to Harriet as General Tubman, for her efforts and would come to greatly respect how Harriet managed to recruit and lead people. While her collaboration with John Brown would tragically be cut short through Brown's hanging after his arrest, the impact he had on her would last until the day Harriet died, and would lead to Harriet becoming directly involved with the Union Army when the American Civil War broke out.
After John Brown's death, Harriet would soon join the Union Army through the connections she made through conspiring rebellions with Brown. Before officially joining the Union, as described by Inez, Harriet would speak at anti-slavery meetings she attended, where she would talk about her accounts of slave escapes and the desperate measures needed to simply stay alive, which would shock her audience. From her public speeches about enslavement, she would be recruited into the Union and quickly became a nurse, where her experience in the Union reveals that people of color would still be mistreated in the Union Army, even though the Union was fighting for abolition. Even before becoming a nurse, she noticed how the priorities of the Union were not focused upon enforcing abolitionist policies for the betterment of people of color across the states, refusing to help the Union recruit people of color due to not believing in a war that did not make the freeing of slaves an explicit goal. When Harriet heard that the soldiers of color were paid half wage compared to their white counterparts, she stopped taking her salary in protest of the unequal treatment. As for those she treated as a nurse, she had to deal with a range of diseases from malnutrition to cholera, only dispensing bourbon or whatever she could get from the military commissary to treat the ill. Using what her mother taught her, Harriet gains a great reputation as a healer who would teach other black women to make goods that could be exchanged for money or supplies.
One of the most stunning accomplishments Harriet had done during her time in the Union Army would be her leading the Combahee River Raid. Before the raid, Harriet would lead, quote, 9 scouts and river pilots, unquote, for reconnaissance missions while being a spy herself. During her own scouting missions, she, quote, gathered information about troop movements, population, sources of supplies, positions of artillery, unquote, as, quote, an old hobbling black woman, unquote, which white Confederates paid little attention to. Through her and her scouting efforts, they had gathered enough information to plan out a raid to liberate a massive amount of enslaved people. As for how the raid itself would play out, Comedy Central's Drunk History, Harriet Tubman leads an army of bad bitches, featuring Octavia Spencer, covers the Combahee River Raid in a humorous way which this clip best demonstrates, along with just how extraordinary Harriet's actions were.
And that's when she went to the colonel and was like, I could totally be a spy for you. I have connects. Like, when I dress up and those people have no idea who I am. And the colonel was like, yeah, obviously my white ass can't go down there. Absolutely, you could be a spy. You go down there and do what the you do. So she was like, okay, let me put on my field hand clothes. And she was like 5 feet tall, so it was very easy for her to like blend into the background. And she is able to like go to the plantations. And she was like, hey guys, like, not to stir up any or whatever, but like, I know y'all are tired of being slaves. I was totally tired of being a slave. And none of us have to be slaves anymore. So like, whoever's down to help the union, just let me know. So everybody was like, cool. And then she would go out. She had these friends who are mariners, which are basically just like people who work in the water, like with water. She's like, I know there are mines out here, so let's work together and find out where this is, because I'm a spy and I'm gonna get this like I'm gonna burn this down. And so then she went back to the colonel and she was like, I have this idea to burn up all the plantations. Here's all my research and you should just let me do it. And the colonel was like, well, it, like I don't have to lose, like let's work together and burn that down. And so they got together and she was like, listen, this is about to be, like, I'm not even about to bullshit you. This is about to be some bullshit. Like, this is about to be like a real stealth operation. You motherfuckers have never seen no shit like this before. Like, I got some dope ass planned out. But I need y'all to all be down and just do what the I say. I got this shit. And in June 1st, 1863, yes. On 1863, they begin this raid. So Harriet Tubman is like on the Combahee River and she was like, I'm down for this, like I'm ready. And so when the raid started, like she knew where the mines and were in the waters, she and her team of mariners were able to be like, oh, that, like, we're not gonna get caught by you stupid ass traps, slave owners. And then the owners of the plantation, these crazy ass racist white people, would see all these black people coming, they'd be like, what the is this? I'm sorry, I'm focused. And they were like, hey, racist ass white person, here's another racist ass white person here to warn you that, Harriet Tubman is coming with her army full of bad bitches. And so then they would start shooting and but by then Harriet Tubman was like, bitch, you're too late. Like, me and my people are already here. And guns back then was like just basic as them guns wasn't doing shit. So they would take their torches and be like, yeah, and go in and just burn these plantations down and then dip. And then they would go again. Like this raid, it was 25 miles along the Combahee River. And they're just like burning down, freeing slaves, getting on the boat, traveling again, avoiding the mines. And so at the end of the end of the raid, Harriet Tubman was like, God damn, I freed 750 slaves. Like, this was dope as hell. And her plan, it was the first military operation that was executed and led by an American woman. And it was planned by a former slave who could not read or write, who was only 5 feet tall, who was both black and a woman. And she still pulled this off. She helped the Union win the war. She freed like at least 1,000 slaves in her lifetime. She was just dope as hell.
As this clip demonstrates, Harriet was a resourceful woman who would rally every ounce of experience and resources she had to accomplish what she believed was the right thing to do. All the while, even though it is not mentioned in this clip, dealing with medical issues like her seizures and the risks such actions had. She had the courage to take great risks to pull off such a raid, to infiltrate plantations and rally together allies and those who wanted to be free and to free others. Harriet's contributions to the Union Army were incredible and were impactful in aiding the Union Army towards their victory.
Segment 4. Injustice never rests, and neither those who resist. Harriet Tubman's life, post-Civil War, and modern-day resistance. Following the tribulations of emancipation and the dissolvement of an economic system, 4 million formerly enslaved black people, who were the backbone of the state, were made to believe that they were now free, and that slavery was no longer. Through institutionalized methods, most notably the prison industrial complex, America regains the indentured labor that they relied on for power. While enslaved Africans and African Americans were considered free by law, and after the Civil War, racial prejudice and discrimination still persisted. As racial prejudice and discrimination shifted from enslavement to segregation, Harriet herself would witness how the dehumanization and growing resentment white America had towards people of color would change and adapt to the new status quo.
The documentary film Harriet Tubman, Visions of Freedom, directed by Stanley Nielsen and Nicole London, delves into Harriet's life post-Civil War near the end of the film. The following clip describes Harriet's experiences with the changing expression of racism and prejudice against women of color like herself after the Civil War.
After the war was over, she leaves Fort Monroe. After being there and it was all said and done, she wanted to come back home to be with her family. She's on the train, has a special ticket, half price ticket that she could ride on the train, any car that she wants to ride on. And so she goes to sit in a car and gets comfortable.
The conductor told her to get out of the mixed car into the smoking car, and she refused. And while she refused, she realized, oh, we're about to fight.
He tries to take her off of her seat, this 4'11", 5-foot woman. And because Harriet is who she is, strong as a ox, he couldn't do it.
He called for reinforcements, other conductors and other passengers, and they ended up throwing her down, breaking her arm and some ribs. And she was able to find her way to New York, but with dire injuries. This is a real humiliation of her dignity, but also a violent act that she suffered.
So she ends the Civil War on this incredible low note of the new taste of the segregation and the new modes of discrimination that were going to emerge immediately out of the carcass of slavery. There's going to be no utopia of equality. Now race-based discrimination is going to take this form.
Injured but unbroken, Tubman returned to her home in Auburn, New York, to take up the struggle in new ways.
It's hard to stop a calling. She believed that it was better to live for a cause than just be cause. And this whole thing of seeing people free and fighting for equality and justice and the right to live free was just something that was within her.
Harriet Tubman took justice. I just see her as someone who epitomizes not waiting until justice catches up to the situation. She used her home in upstate New York to shelter elderly, formerly enslaved people.
After America's deadliest war, African Americans were quote-unquote free. Why was it that Tubman had to face these serious physical injuries, and not to mention immense damage to her dignity? The larger issue at hand of slavery has not yet disintegrated and can be seen to this day and today. The U.S. is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. And I'm sure we can all guess who is in these prisons. On top of this, 95% of elected prosecutors throughout the United States are white. Shocking statistics, and even more ghastly when further examined.
The civil rights movement.
Nixon administration official has admitted that the war on drugs is all about throwing black people in jail. He said, quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people." You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
America has transformed our prior system of slavery into a new kind of slavery. This is why we must take inspiration from Harriet Tubman and resist this system. I am speaking to you loudly and clearly so that you will hear me. We must resist. You must resist. An injustice to one is an injustice to all.
Back in the stars, feel the night. That's when I'm gonna stand up. Take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home. Far across the river, can you hear freedom calling? Calling me to answer. Gonna keep on keeping on. I can feel it.